The Grand Hall had been prepared for ceremony, elaborate ritual that would somehow legitimize Crown Princess Talira's unprecedented declaration that she would choose her own consort, rather than accept the arranged marriage that Velassi tradition demanded. Dr. James Cooper stood in the observer section among perhaps 300 beings who'd gathered for this historic event, watching the empty chairs and trying to understand the cultural dynamics that were creating such profound paralysis. The Velassi were a proud species whose elaborate social hierarchies had governed their civilization for 12,000 documented years. Royal marriages were always negotiated between great houses, carefully arranged alliances designed to balance political factions and consolidate power across the empire's complex web of noble families. But Crown Princess Talira had refused to accept an arranged marriage, had declared that she would choose her own consort from whoever had the courage to present themselves, or she would abdicate rather than submit to a marriage she had no voice in creating. The imperial court, faced with losing their heir to the throne, had reluctantly agreed to this ceremony. But their reluctance showed in every aspect of how they'd structured it, making candidates publicly declare themselves by taking one of 20 chairs arranged in a semicircle facing the dais, creating maximum exposure and risk for anyone who chose to present themselves. The chairs sat empty, 20 precise positions, each representing a potential suitor's place, each remaining conspicuously unoccupied 30 minutes into a ceremony that should have begun with eager candidates presenting themselves. Talira sat on the dais in full formal regalia, flanked by her mother Empress Serena and chief advisor Catherine. Her expression was composed, dignified, giving nothing away about what she was thinking as she watched chair after chair remain empty, while potential suitors calculated whether the risk of presenting themselves was worth taking. James had attended this ceremony because his research on Velassi cultural evolution gave him legitimate academic reason to observe important events, and because the unprecedented nature of this open selection made it historically significant regardless of outcome. But watching the empty chairs and the increasingly uncomfortable silence, James was beginning to understand that he was witnessing potential failure rather than historic success. The hall was filled with potential suitors, Velassi nobles from lesser houses who theoretically could present themselves, representatives from allied species who'd been quietly positioning themselves as possible candidates, ambitious individuals who traveled to the capital specifically hoping to be chosen as consort to the crown princess, but none of them were moving toward the chairs, because taking a chair meant publicly declaring yourself as candidate, meant putting yourself forward for judgment by Talira, by the assembled court, by the Velassi nobility watching to see who had the audacity to present themselves, by the political factions who would immediately begin calculating what your candidacy meant for their interests. The risk was enormous. Present yourself and be rejected, public humiliation that could destroy your political standing and social position. Present yourself and be chosen. Instant elevation to scrutiny and responsibility that few people were prepared for. Everyone was calculating, measuring consequence, lineage, political cost, waiting for someone else to move first, to take the risk, to break the paralysis of collective hesitation. James found himself watching Talira more than watching the empty chairs. She maintained perfect composure, but he could see the growing tension in how she held herself. She demanded this choice, had put her position as heir at risk to avoid being reduced to a political bargaining chip in arranged marriage negotiations. And the courage she'd shown was being met with calculated restraint. With empty chairs that communicated a clear message, no one believed the potential reward was worth the definite risk. 40 minutes into the ceremony, still no movement toward the chairs. James made a decision that had very little to do with actually wanting to be royal consort, and everything to do with recognizing that someone needed to break the silence before this ceremony became complete humiliation for a princess who'd had the courage to demand agency in her own life. He stood. James walked forward from his position in the observer section, acutely aware that every eye in the grand hall was tracking his movement across the empty floor space between the observers and the waiting chairs. He wasn't Velassi nobility, wasn't from an allied species with political standing in the empire. wasn't anyone who had obvious claim to position as royal consort. He was a human xenoanthropologist whose research gave him reason to be present at important cultural events, but who had no business presenting himself as candidate for marriage to the crown princess of the Velassi Empire. But someone needed to be first. Someone needed to demonstrate that taking a chair, that publicly declaring candidacy, was actually possible rather than just theoretical option that everyone was too afraid to attempt. James reached the semicircle of empty chairs, chose one roughly in the middle of the arrangement, and sat, facing the dais where Talira watched him with an expression that had shifted from composed dignity to sharp, focused attention. The effect on the hall was immediate and profound. The ambient noise, quiet conversations, shifting movement, the sounds of hundreds of beings in formal gathering, stopped completely. Every single person in the grand hall was staring at the human who'd just taken a chair, who just publicly declared himself as candidate for position that carried more political weight and social significance than most people would face in their entire lives. James maintained what he hoped looked like calm composure despite his racing heart. He'd just done something that could be interpreted multiple ways depending on perspective: courageous declaration of interest, presumptuous overreach by someone with no legitimate standing, or possibly academic observer taking action to prevent ceremony's complete failure. He didn't actually know which interpretation would dominate. Just knew that the alternative, watching Talira sit there facing empty chairs for another hour while potential suitors convinced themselves that the risk wasn't worth taking, had seemed unconscionable. On the dais, Chief Advisor Keithrin leaned toward Talira, speaking urgently in low tones that James couldn't hear but whose intent was clear from body language, questioning whether a human could even be considered legitimate candidate, whether James's presence in the chairs should be acknowledged or dismissed as some kind of mistake or inappropriate presumption. Talira responded with something sharp enough that Keithrin straightened and fell silent. Her tone had carried authority that ended the debate regardless of what specific words she'd used. Then something happened that James hadn't anticipated. Another person stood from the observer section and walked toward the chairs. Lord Velassi, a Velassi noble from a minor house that James recognized from his cultural research as having some wealth and regional influence, but limited standing in imperial politics. Velassi had been standing near the back of the hall, apparently calculating, just like everyone else, whether to present himself. He walked to the chairs and sat 3 positions away from James. Then another movement caught James's attention. Lady Sereth, a Velassi from a prominent merchant family that had considerable economic power but little political influence because of their non-noble origins. She walked to the chairs and sat on the other side of James. Then another person moving. And another. A Korathi diplomat who'd been serving in Velassi space for years. A Thessari scholar who'd apparently traveled here specifically hoping for opportunity to present herself. A Velassi military officer from a provincial family without significant court connections. Within 5 minutes of James taking the first chair, 12 of the 20 positions were occupied. James realized with something between satisfaction and mild shock what had just happened. He'd broken the paralysis. By being first to sit, by taking the risk that everyone else had been calculating themselves out of, he demonstrated that occupying these chairs didn't immediately result in disaster or humiliation. His action had reframed the silence. What had been collective hesitation driven by fear became a series of individual decisions that people could make once someone showed them that action was possible. The political cost of being first to present yourself as candidate had been enormous, facing all the scrutiny and judgment with no one else sharing the exposure, taking all the risk of public rejection alone. But the cost of being 3rd or 5th or 8th was manageable. Once others had presented themselves, you weren't alone in your declaration. You were joining a group rather than standing out as solitary target for judgment. James had given them permission to act by showing that action wouldn't kill you. After all, those willing to present themselves had taken chairs. Final count showed 15 occupied positions, 5 remaining empty. Crown Princess Talira spoke publicly for the first time since the ceremony had begun. Thank you to those who had the courage to step forward and present yourselves as candidates. Your willingness to make yourselves vulnerable to judgment and potential rejection demonstrates character that traditional arranged marriage would never reveal. Her voice carried throughout the grand hall with the kind of trained projection that royalty developed for public speaking. I particularly want to acknowledge Dr. James Cooper, who was first to take a chair when doing so required the most courage, because there was no one else sharing the risk, and no guarantee that anyone would follow his example. She looked directly at James. His action broke the hesitation that was paralyzing this ceremony and preventing others from making their own choices. That demonstrates something I value deeply: the willingness to act when action serves principle rather than personal advantage, when being first carries the highest cost, when there's no guarantee of success or even of not being alone in your choice. Over the following 3 weeks, Talira conducted private meetings with each of the 15 candidates who'd presented themselves, getting to know them beyond their public positions and political calculations, asking questions about their values, their understanding of what serving as royal consort would require, their reasons for choosing to present themselves despite the risk and uncertainty. James's meeting lasted perhaps 30 minutes. He was honest with her. He'd presented himself not because he wanted to be royal consort, but because someone needed to be first, because watching her courage in demanding this choice be met with empty chairs had seemed wrong, because he couldn't stand watching potential suitors paralyze themselves with calculation and fear. Talira listened with the same focused attention she'd shown when he first took his chair. Asked thoughtful questions about his research, his time in Velassi space, his understanding of their culture, then thanked him for his honesty and his willingness to take action that served her dignity rather than his own advancement. 2 weeks later, she announced her choice: Lord Velassi, the Velassi noble who'd been second to take a chair. The selection made political sense in ways James's candidacy never could have. Velassi brought legitimate noble lineage, understanding of Velassi court dynamics, and enough political backing to make the marriage alliance workable while being from minor enough house that it didn't dramatically shift the balance of power among the great families. But James was summoned to private audience the day after the announcement was made public. "You didn't actually want to be my consort, did you?" Talira asked directly once they were alone in a private study rather than formal throne room. "No, Your Highness," James admitted. "I barely know you beyond formal diplomatic interactions and cultural observations from my research. I presented myself because someone needed to be first, and because the alternative seemed unconscionable." "I know," Talira said. "I recognized during our private meeting that you'd acted from principle rather than from personal ambition. That's precisely why your action mattered so much." She gestured for him to sit in one of the comfortable chairs the study offered rather than maintaining formal standing protocol. "Lord Velassi told me during his private meeting that he only found the courage to present himself after watching you move first. That's seeing a human with no political position in Velassi society, no claim to noble lineage, no obvious personal advantage from being chosen, seeing you calmly take a chair and survive the scrutiny, made him ashamed of his own hesitation. He said your action gave him courage," Talira continued. "Showed him that the risk he was calculating could actually be taken, that sitting in those chairs was possible rather than just theoretical option he was too afraid to attempt. You didn't just break the paralysis that was threatening to collapse the entire ceremony," she said. "You redefined what courage looked like in that moment, showed that it could arrive without spectacle or flourish, without claims of worth or announcements of qualification. Just someone standing up and taking the step no one else would take. That reframed the choice for everyone watching," Talira explained. "Made it possible for them to act because you demonstrated through your example that action wouldn't result in immediate disaster. The first person to move changed the meaning of the choice itself, turned it from terrifying leap into manageable risk that could be survived." She paused. "I'm grateful for that, not just because it allowed me to meet Lord Velassi and the others who presented themselves, but because you showed me something important about how courage actually manifests, not always through dramatic heroism or bold declarations, but sometimes through quiet willingness to go first when everyone else is paralyzed by calculation and fear." James considered how to respond to this. "I was worried it might seem presumptuous. a human presenting himself for position he had no legitimate claim to. It might have, Talira acknowledged, if you'd approached it as genuine candidacy rather than as action taken to break the silence and give others courage to make their own choices. But your honesty during our private meeting made your intentions clear. You weren't claiming to be worthy of the position. You were demonstrating that claiming it was possible. That distinction matters, she said, and I wanted you to know that I recognize what you did and why you did it. You gave me something valuable, not your candidacy, but your willingness to act when action served principle rather than advantage. That's a quality I value highly, and one that will inform how I think about leadership when I eventually take the throne. Months later, after Talira's formal engagement to Lord Velassi had been celebrated, and the political implications had been analyzed extensively by court observers, James found himself discussing the ceremony with other human researchers working in Velassi space. How did you end up presenting yourself as candidate for royal consort? They asked with barely concealed amusement and confusion. You're a cultural anthropologist, not a diplomat or noble. What were you thinking? I was thinking that someone needed to be first, James explained. The ceremony was collapsing. 20 empty chairs and a crown princess watching potential suitors calculate themselves into paralysis. Everyone measuring risk, assessing political cost, waiting for someone else to move first. So you moved first, one of his colleagues said. Without any of the qualifications or political backing that would make you viable candidate. Exactly, James confirmed. Because the point wasn't to actually be chosen, the point was to break the hesitation. To demonstrate through action that taking a chair was possible rather than just theoretical option people were too afraid to attempt. Once one person sits down, others can follow, he continued. The cost of being first is enormous, all the scrutiny, all the judgment, all the risk with no one sharing the exposure. But the cost of being third or eighth is manageable. My action gave 15 other people permission to make their own choices by showing them that the step they feared was actually achievable. You redefined what courage meant in that moment, another researcher observed. I showed what it could look like, James corrected. Not dramatic or spectacular, just willingness to go first when everyone else is waiting. To act without flourish or claim of worthiness. To take the step that reframes the silence and turns absence into decision. The chairs were empty not because no one wanted to be royal consort, he explained, but because everyone was afraid to be first. Once someone demonstrated that sitting in those chairs wouldn't result in immediate disaster, calculated restraint gave way to individual choice. Did Princess Talira appreciate that? Someone asked. She recognized what I'd done and why, James said. Understood that I wasn't genuinely claiming to be worthy candidate, but was instead taking action to prevent the ceremony's collapse and give others courage to present themselves. She was grateful for that, not because she wanted to choose me, but because I enabled her to actually meet the people who did want to present themselves, but needed someone to break the paralysis first. He paused, thinking about Talira's words during their private audience. She said something that stuck with me, that the first person to act reshapes the meaning of the choice for everyone waiting. That courage doesn't always arrive with spectacle. Sometimes it's just quiet willingness to go first, to take the risk others are calculating themselves out of, to demonstrate through example rather than through persuasion that action is possible. That's what happened with those empty chairs, James concluded. They stayed empty because everyone was waiting for someone else to take the risk. Then one person, me, demonstrated that the risk could be survived. And suddenly, 15 others found the courage to make their own choices because I'd shown them that choosing was possible. In a place where intent is usually disguised in ritual and calculation, he said, simple movement forward spoke plainly. No flourish, no claim of worth, just taking the step no one else would take, that reframed everything. The story of the empty chairs and the human who was first to sit became a minor legend in Velassi space, cited as example of how courage can arrive without spectacle, how the willingness to go first can give others permission to act, and how human directness can sometimes break through the paralysis that elaborate cultural protocols create. The chairs had remained empty until someone moved forward. Then they filled, not because suddenly everyone became braver, but because one person demonstrated that action was possible. Human willingness in contrast to calculated restraint. courage arriving without spectacle. The first person to act reshaping the meaning of the choice itself for everyone who waited. Sometimes that's all it takes. Someone willing to go first, to take the risk others fear, to demonstrate through simple movement forward that the step everyone is calculating themselves out of is actually achievable. The chairs were empty. Then a human moved forward, and everything changed.